Hello, folks. Once again, we're back. It's the DeFi Collective with Robert Vaughn and Alex Jewell, where we
So,
cover all things that have to do with decentralized finance, crypto, blockchain, you name it. If it's on the chain, if it has anything to do with decentralized finance, we cover it here. Today, we've got a great show. And again, you can reach us at the DeFi Collective at gmail.com. When we do our shows, we respond to requests that we get from our listeners. And a few of our listeners wanted us to talk about globalism, capitalism, and decentralized finance, and how they the interplay between them, how they work together, and what's going on with them, and where are we going to end up. So I think it would behoove us to start out. I'm going to start with a brief history of capitalism, then I'm going to pitch it over to Alex. He's going to talk about globalism. And then we're going to tie them all together with decentralized finance and see what the nature and significance of decentralized finance is. Because whether, you're probably aware of it if you watch the show, but people are not, our financial system is in a state of flux. It's kind of moving away from centralized finance, which means where you have a bank or a central entity, to what's called decentralized finance, where you have finance, finance technology, finance on the blockchain, where a lot of people are making their own decisions. So what we want to do is sort of talk about that a little bit and see how how it affects you, because most people want to know what's in it for me, or how does it affect me, or what does that have to do with me. And so we're going to tell you. Okay, so let's talk about we're going to talk about capitalism a little bit. And I just want to give like a real brief history. Capitalism, I guess, really started um, a few years ago, a couple hundred years ago. The first society to really be benefit of capitalism was United Kingdom, UK, and that's where the Industrial Revolution sort of took off. And prior to the early 1800s, late 1700s, mid 1800s, that sort of was the hotbed, or the birth of industrialized capitalism. After that, one of the things about capitalism is that um, after you sell to your own people, you run out of customers in your particular country. So typically, what happens is you go to another country. We've seen it with the car makers going to China, and back then the UK said, well, the obvious place to go is to a growing economy like the USA. So they kind of expand to the USA. But what happened was the USA was a little better at capitalism than the UK was, and pretty soon most of the industry was over here, and most of the money being made was over here. Interesting fact: in 1910, early 1900s, Cleveland, Ohio, was the wealthiest city in the world. And when I say that, people say you're crazy. But you had Rockefeller, you had old man Rockefeller, they called him, who at that time owned or controlled 98% of the oil business in the world. And I'm talking about the mining of oil, the distribution of refining. He pretty much owned it all. And then Stalin said, "Oh, you know what? We're going to do some of this in Russia too." So Russia kind of got on the oil bandwagon. But so things have changed. I mean, Cleveland is not the richest city in the world anymore, but it was the headquarters for steel, for aluminum, for oil. It was the second largest producer of automobiles in the world after Detroit. It was the number one producer of motorcycles. So one thing that happens with capitalism is as it expands and goes to other places, sometimes other people are better at doing things than you are. Or either in the case of China or Japan, they do them cheaper. So one of the problems with capitalism, though, is that usually a country's um, the total amount of goods and services is called the gross domestic product, GDP, and that's usually a measure of how healthy, or not how healthy, but how much money a country is worth. For instance, the GDP of the United States is about 21 trillion. The GDP of China is about 15 trillion. The GDP of Italy is about 1.8 trillion. which is actually more than the GDP of Russia, which is 1.5 trillion. But what happens is sometimes that money gets concentrated, and you have income disparity that's like off the charts, like you have in the United States. So although a lot of money is being made and taking place, it doesn't get distributed like it does, say, in Norway or Sweden, where you have a growing, the GDP is growing at about a 3 to 4% rate over the last 20 years, but you don't have the income disparity because a lot of that money gets spread out or gets divvied up among not just the wealthiest people, but the middle class. And that's why they have a thriving middle and upper middle class, and ours is kind of going away. So one of the things about capitalism is that it reaches a point where you have this concentration of wealth. And once that happens, it doesn't work so good anymore, because a lot of the people that used to buy your products, like the average price of a car is $42,000 of a new car, $42,000. The average wage, what's the minimum wage? $7 or $8, and people are making $12 an hour, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, $12." Well, you're not going to buy a new car at $12 an hour. You're probably not going to buy a house. So it's creating two different economies. One for 10%, and the other people are not really going to be involved because they won't be able to afford to. Okay, so capitalism. Now, Alex, talk a little bit about globalism and how this sort of plays into the global economy, and talk about the metamorphosis and sort of how this came to be, and where we're at now.
Yeah, I mean, well, globalism kind of came out of the rise of capitalism. You had companies that wanted to expand. You had emerging markets, and really, you can kind of see remnants of this as far back as of imperialistic movements of giants like of Great Britain, where they were like, well, we could we could go and find these commodities here. We could go take over this land there. And they started taking over trades and things like that. And really you saw this global trade become a very robust system. But just like now, you had only a few people who sort of benefited from that system, because at the end of the day, if the companies are centralized in the West and they sort of move out and take over economies or take over commodities and workers in other places, the impact of that is not positive on the place that they are, where they're moving towards. Right. They're not moving towards those markets for production in order to benefit like the community around those factories and stuff. They're moving to those places because in capitalistic systems, you have this trend line down in terms of cost. So they look to reduce cost and increase profits. What costs companies the most? Materials, workers, overhead of factories, right? So if they can find places to milk those things out of at cheaper cost, in other words, places that are more vulnerable and more willing to do that because it may be one of their only options, it becomes inherently a predatory system. Now, when we talk about globalism, the problem with globalism is not necessarily the global economy itself. There's plenty of great ways to share goods and services and businesses cross-border. In fact, that's a wonderful thing to share culture, to share things that maybe we have bananas here and somebody doesn't have bananas there. Like that's a wonderful thing to be able to share that. The problem is really rooted in the predatory nature of that business, and also the unregulated growth of these businesses without their return even on the society that they're started in, right? So if you have a company like Amazon, and Amazon is relying greatly on the cheap global market of certain things, but they're still paying their own workers here in America less than a living wage, you have a serious issue there, right? Because that means that all of the profit is simply being centralized towards the top, and the whole entire rest of the world is suffering at the hands of that centralization and that overproduction of usually lower quality materials as well. So there's this inherent conflict of interest between how companies create that trend line that they want for growth of lower cost and higher profits. And there's a conflict of interest between that and everybody else on the planet, except for the people who benefit from it. And that's really the real issue with the current brand of globalism that we're dealing with. Now, this is, sometimes it's not, it's an interesting issue if it's it's not always intended to hurt other people. You see a company like Apple who's making a decision between, and of course, Apple does have its own issues in terms of its production and who that it affects. But sometimes it's interesting to look at the reason companies go global. A company like Apple was never going to go global because they genuinely care about helping the communities overseas. The problem is that they had a decision in order to grow. They either have to open up the market segments at home that they want to cater to, which would mean cheaper product lines, or they can go target the more expensive market segments elsewhere. So a company like Apple, they grow as a company globally, not just for production, but also for sales. They're growing globally because they've sort of tackled the expensive device market here in the US, but they're not going to release cheaper products that would be off-brand. They're the company that makes $100 iPad pencils. So what they're going to do to grow as a business and reach their, how their next projections is they're going to sell those $100 pencils in China, and they're going to sell those $100 pencils in Japan and Australia, and Luxembourg and Germany, right? They're going to sell those expensive products in markets that have those expensive market segments where they can work, so that they don't have to provide products that are accessible to other classes of individuals.
Right. And one of the things that happens, China has Apple stores in China that aren't really Apple stores. They look just like Apple stores. They're knockoff Apple stores. And they sell knockoff iPhones and knockoff iPads and knockoff iMacs.
Yeah.
And they're not really Apple stores because, from what I understand, Apple didn't want to share technology with China. And I mean, who can blame them?
No.
Who can blame them? So you wind up with these knockoff stores that aren't really Apple products. One of the things about globalism is that you hear a lot on the news. Well, it's the Russian oligarchs. Like they're this different species of people. They're just billionaires, like the 1,000 billionaires we have here in this country, and the billionaires elsewhere in the world. You know, they're people who've made a lot of money. The Russian oligarchs made money. They were actually, when Russia switched over from socialism to capitalism under, I believe was it Gorbachev or Boris Yeltsin? I can't remember who, but it happened like 89 and 91 when they and all the guys that were managing these plants, they said, okay, you guys know how to run them. Well, here you can just buy them and we'll sell them to you, and the government will finance you to purchase this plant that you know how to run. So that's how most of them acquired their money. And, a lot of Russians didn't think that was fair, that the guy that ran the plant now owns the plant, and a lot of industries, I mean, when they are in an industry, they run the whole industry, like aluminum. Russia's big in aluminum. They have an 80,000 ton press, which is bigger than any we have over here. I think Alcoa has 250,000 ton presses here and one in Cali. But when they go into an industry, I mean, they go in and they take over the whole industry in the country. It's not like, the free enterprise system. It's, it's what you call raw dog capitalism. And so you couldn't just go over there and say, I have a cheaper way of smelting aluminum and I want to build an aluminum plant. No, but they can come over here because the people over there can't buy their product anymore. So they give Mitch McConnell some money and say, hey, we're going to build a plant, in Kentucky, and we're going to build one in Tennessee, which is near the Alcoa plant. And they say, okay, that's a great idea, because they bring jobs. They do bring jobs, But one of the things, I think, one of the thing that gets misconstructed or misunderstood about globalism is that under globalism, you have people, and if you ever look at the board of directors of the company, it's the same people from all over the world that sit on most of the boards of these major corporations. And they're really not beholden to any one country. They may feint to be beholden to a particular country in case they need some cover, they need some muscle. You know what I'm saying? In
Right.
case something goes crazy in another country and they try to nationalize their plants, and they can say, hey, Biden, you got to sit over the Marines, man. They're trying to take my money. But they're usually not really beholden to any one country, because they have plants and they make money everywhere. And I
Right.
think people have been slow to kind of realize and accept that. Is that you have and you can't call them oligarchs and call the other ones billionaires. They're all the same guy. They belong to the same clubs. If you go to Monaco, you can see them all at the same crap table. You know what I'm saying? So they're all the same guy.
Sort of
So
like when you go to the grocery store, you go to different grocery stores to get different things. You're like, I go to this store for this thing and this store for this thing. That's how billionaires think about countries, right? Like countries to them are not like homes necessarily. And well, most of them probably have homes for them, but like countries for them are part of this much larger thing that they've built, right? This empire of whatever company or whatever they do. The countries are just like they're useful to them in some way or another, right? They're either a market that's valuable to them, they're either a commodity that's valuable to them, they're either production that's valuable to them, they're tax, they're friendly to how they want to do their taxes. They have like a certain number of grants or types of bank accounts that work the best. Like they use these countries for specific reasons. And like you said, they're not beholden to any single one. They can travel freely. If they don't like something happening in one country, well,
yeah,
like, okay.
try to take my yacht in Denmark. Well, I'm just going to move it to Israel, where I have a dual citizenship.
Right.
So I'm also a Ukrainian, a Russian oligarch who's of Ukrainian descent, but I happen to also be, have citizenship in Israel, and you can't bother me when I get there.
You buy $500,000 worth of real estate somewhere, and you get citizenship. Like,
but that's what happened in London. That's what really drove the property values up. Same thing with New York City. I mean,
yep.
There's no penthouse that's worth $80 million.
But it's happening here too. I mean, they're building 5 new buildings right across there, 5 new buildings, and we don't need more. There's not like Chicagoans moving into those. Like we don't have there's not a shortage of housing, but what's happening year after year, we've been the city with the most foreign investment. China is buying up huge whole entire floors. You have companies that buy up entire floors. Like the floor that we used to live in this building was bought by a company called Casa to turn it into like Airbnb style things for businesses, for like people who are visiting on business. So you have a bunch of like Chinese businessmen and stuff who are visiting here who have this, free place to to stay. So you have the situation where a lot of the market is even in the US is influenced by foreign interest, but specifically foreign interest by the billionaire classes of in those countries, not people who are relatable to us in terms of their financial status.
Right. And it's a place to park your money.
Right.
If you have a lot of money, especially if you were a Russian with a lot of rubles, and this war broke out, if you didn't get into dollars in a hurry, I mean, you were crazy. Because I talked to a gentleman who sells real estate in New York, and they almost like they knew there was going to be a war. And a lot of them started buying up, started parking their money in those expensive places. And it's a good, safe, it's probably better than a bank. I mean, you buy a penthouse for 80 million, you keep it for 3 years, and then you sell it for 100 million, it's a good place to park money,
Yeah.
and it's almost better than a bank, because the dollar has been pretty good so far. I think the Chinese yuan is trying to trying to upstage the dollar now and take the
It
dollar.
is interesting seeing what's happening with different alliances in terms of like what this has caused is really a subtle wrestling match between, you know, it's giving them an opportunity to try to fight for who the de facto trade currency is going to be. And the reason that the US dollar has been valuable for so long is because it has been for a very long time the de facto trade currency, especially for things like oil, right? And when countries can now form an alliance and take advantage of situations like this, you have the possibility of something like the yen, you know, kind of moving in and, you know, like.
And I think when you have a big player like the Saudis, they're still in dollars, but they're getting a little. There's some rumblings, and they're getting a little upset because Biden won't let them do what Trump let them do. So I mean, you could see a move sometimes, and I don't think it would be allowed to happen if they say, okay, we're out of dollars and we're in the Chinese yuan. I think there probably would be some yellow cake uranium over there or something that we had to stop them from making bombs with. You know, that seems to be a convenient excuse. But I think if they thought they could get away with it, they would do it in a heartbeat. But I don't think they can get away with it. But like you said, Alex, there's a lot of people are choosing sides. Russia just tried to make all of their oil shipments. You had to pay for them in rubles, but nobody would go for that. You know, which it would have, kind of jacked, probably up, caused the price of rubles to increase. The ruble to increase, I'm sure it would have. It probably would have brought it back to where it was, and maybe even a little higher. But people don't want to take a chance to hold rubles, knowing that they might go down, so they still want to deal in dollars. Globalism, capitalism, and now you got this thing called decentralized finance. You've got blockchain. Which on the blockchain things are much different. They work much different than things do with capitalism. Alex, what are some of the ways that they work differently, other than rehypothecated treasuries or something like that? Rehypothecated gold. What that means is that you can form a holding company and acquire some treasuries from the U.S. government, 10 million in treasuries, and you can loan them out to 9 different people, the same treasuries, and you can collect interest on 9 different treasury accounts. Now that's great. It's like a legal, what do you call it, a Ponzi scheme or something? It's like a legal Ponzi scheme. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And as long as nobody, 2 people ask for their money all at once, you're in good shape. That's the same thing banks do, by the way. Because if that's why when everybody went to the bank in 1929 and wanted their money, there was no money there because they didn't have the money. They had loaned it out, because you have what's called the reserve requirement, where you can loan out 90% of what you take in. So if I put 100 million in Alex's bank, he's only got to keep 10, and he can loan that out, loan the rest of it out.
Right.
And the money that I put in there probably isn't real money anyway. It's probably just a letter of credit from my bank.
Right.
Which may or may not be worth $100 million. So decentralized finance, blockchain, is starting to have an effect. Alex, talk about that a little bit. How is it affecting the financial markets?
Well, I mean, for one, it's immediate settlement. So, right now, when you have sort of this very cumbersome set of networks that have been built up over a long period of time, so you've had bandages put on top of bandages, you've had virtualizations put on top of virtualizations. It's just not efficient. I mean, whenever you cash a loan or you cash a check or something, or a lot of like traditional financial things that people needed to do took a long time, and they still take a long time. And the reason they take a long time,
try cashing a check for $100,000 and see how many weeks they have to hold it.
Yeah, right. Or even just try getting $100,000 out of the bank at one time. the amount of work that goes into doing little things is phenomenal. And it's because they sort of just built infrastructure on top of infrastructure instead of really building the thing from, starting over and building something that works. And what's amazing about blockchain, it's a really simple set of principles. One, it's fully transparent. So if you put your Bitcoin into, let's say, some sort of liquidity pool and you're going to earn interest on it, you see it there. You're the only one who can sign it out. You've signed it in, and you can see everything on chain that's occurred. And so there's this it's called trustless. There's this idea of it being a trustless technology, because you don't need to trust somebody as some form of IOU. You don't need to trust anything. You can see where everything is on chain. There is not some centralized entity that you need to take their word for it and believe that they're super kosher with how they're doing it. You can just see for yourself. Right. And so it sounds really simple, but it's kind of groundbreaking because banking's never worked that way, right? A long time ago, before banking, you sort of just had to take people at their word. And then if they broke their word, you probably shot them. And that's how human beings have worked. The majority of our civilization has been, systems of trust and sort of reactions to if that trust is broken. And sort of also mutually assured destruction in many cases now too. But what banking did is it solved this fundamental trust issue of like, the bank sits in the middle and it ends up, making the most money out of this deal because it does that, but essentially says, I know A is worth this much, I know B is worth this much, and I can facilitate whatever exchange needs to occur because I don't care about either of you. And so as a bank in the middle, I can be the expensive, bloated infrastructure in the middle to make sure things work. And what happened is the
house man at a poker game. Huh?
Right. And what happened is they took advantage of that situation and they screwed the whole thing up. And so what blockchain offers us is the ability to have that same assurances in terms of how we conduct business without needing to trust a bank in the middle or pay a bank in the middle. And that's sort of that idea of decentralized finance, right? Decentralized finance ends up being that fully transparent, immediately settlable, fully liquid, right? Way of conducting business. Because when you talk about things like rehypothecated loans, you're really talking about this idea of not having the real liquidity behind where where you put your mouth at or how you conduct business. And that's a serious issue. That's breaking trust, right? And so how everything works in crypto is that in order to do anything, to move anything, to sign anything, the entire network has to agree and confirm that you can. So, and you have to sign as the owner of things, or the person who makes a decision for myself. I have to sign every transaction for my assets. I can't just trust other people with it. And so that's a huge thing. And a lot of people don't understand this. They don't understand sort of the beauty of blockchain, the beautiful simplicity of it. A lot of people, they call it things like a Ponzi scheme and things like that. And it's because they inherently don't know that, like, you can go to a site right now that is just a window on chain and see where everybody's assets are. And it's not associated with your name, it's associated with your address on chain, but everything's verifiable. No money is getting taken out and put somewhere else and then told, so that you're told one thing. It's impossible to do that because everything's visible. And so with that visibility, with that reversal of ownership that we talk a lot about, and with this brilliant design economically of standardizing an economy by data, by digital assets that work for the digital economy, you're standardizing an economy with economics way sounder than our previous economy was designed, at least in terms of its longevity. And so you have a standardized economy, standardized by things that actually exist, that are scarce and exist, like Bitcoin, that were designed by design, that's designed to be deflationary over time. And so you have this standardized economy that hasn't been virtualized, it hasn't been manipulated, that hasn't been destroyed by the greed of banks and institutions and people who took advantage of that system of trust because you can't. And so now you have this new system that's designed really well economically, even for how things used to work, but it's especially designed well for a digital economy where we can regain trust in the economy that we own ourselves.
Right. And, this is probably more prevalent than most people know. Blockchain, for instance, El Salvador is a blockchain country now. Their Bitcoin is the denomination that the government favors to do business in. That's a whole country. Ethiopia, I believe, has adopted. Wow, what was it? Ethereum? No, it wasn't Ethereum. It was another token, another blockchain token, to be their token that the country prefers. So a lot of ways, a lot of business in Nigeria now is done through blockchain because people feel more comfortable with blockchain than they do with some of the banks.
Yep.
So they'll keep their money on a blockchain when they want to. And a nice thing about blockchain and Bitcoin and any sort of cryptocurrency is that all you need really is a cell phone to be a player. You don't have to have a bank account. You don't have to have owned property. You don't have to live here. You don't have to have a social security number. You can trade crypto if you have a wallet and a wallet address.
Mm-hmm.
And 70% of the people on Earth are unbanked. That means they don't use banks. I think
Right.
in the United States, it's almost 40% of people in the United States don't use banks. You've had a lot of these other things come up, sort of, like payday loan companies, money transfer companies, where if you're going to a different country, you can deposit money here and they'll give it back to you over there minus 15 or 20% fee. I mean, I guess the fees are pretty steep now.
Yeah.
And now, with cryptocurrency, you can do business all around the world. One Bitcoin is equals one Bitcoin, no matter where you are.
Yeah.
And it's not something that the government can manipulate. China has been notorious for manipulating their currency. And oh, by the way, we do the same thing here.
Right. And I just want to note too around manipulation, because a lot of people notice that like the US dollar price of things can get manipulated, right? And that's very real. So some recent studies even shown that a lot of crypto exchanges, like a huge amount of the volume is manipulation. I mean, it's a part of the reality that if you have a centralized company that profits off of a digital asset like Bitcoin, and they're still profiting off of it in US dollars, then they're going to, if they have liquidity to do it, they're going to do interesting things to try to create price manipulation for themselves. And technically a lot of that's legal still.
Arbitrage, sort of
but
like an arbitrage.
Right. It is. It's it's not pretty. But the reality is that that's not a problem with Bitcoin. It's not a problem with cryptocurrency. It's inherently a problem with treating it that way within the existing system, right? So when you're manipulating it against the US dollar pair, then you're not manipulating Bitcoin. You're manipulating how Bitcoin is perceived in the US dollar market, right? That pair is an indicator of the illness of the existing system and is not indicative of Bitcoin. Why? Because Bitcoin is not changing in value. Bitcoin's not changing in terms of how it works. Bitcoin's not changing in terms of its utility, in terms of its halving every 4 years. It's not changing in terms of its miner rewards. Bitcoin is designed the same way that it, whether the market's up or down, Bitcoin works the same way. And there's always going to be only 21 million of them when all of them are mined. Okay. And so the manipulation of a commodity, like for example, gold, you had JP Morgan Chase artificially manipulate the price of gold to the point where they were trading ounces of gold that don't even exist on the planet. Is that a problem with gold? No, that's not a problem with gold itself. It's not a problem with the utility of gold. We can all agree that gold is still valuable, especially because it's actually has real utility in terms of like space exploration.
But
And
if I could just interject this, if you have some gold certificates that give you ownership to gold, go try to get the gold and see what
yeah,
happens.
actually, well, that's what I'm saying. When you've manipulated a commodity that is scarce to the point where its market representation is manipulated, that's an indicator of an ill market. It's not an indicator of gold itself being a broken commodity, right? That's a dishonest market.
Gold
And
futures,
so,
for example. Yeah,
yeah.
gold
So I
futures.
think that's I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people see the manipulation of Bitcoin's US dollar price, and that's a manipulation of US dollar price within the US dollar market.
Okay, okay. But Bitcoin is based on there being a limited amount available. And when there's a limited amount available, the demand increases, which increases the price. Now, as we move forward, um, money that's in banks, a lot of it is going to be coming into Bitcoin. And I know a guy that works at a company, and that's what they do. They have custody of money, of digital assets for banks, and a lot of money is coming into Bitcoin. And I think as that happens, you're going to see the price of Bitcoin increase. But the different thing about Bitcoin is that the price is the price no matter where you are. And that's the price. No one company is not, you know, I guess in the early 1800s, before the U.S. banking system really came into being and there was some regulation, anybody in any state or city could start a bank. This is Alex's bank, or this is Robert's bank. This is the Bank of Columbus, Ohio, or something. Robert Von President,
Right.
and they could issue banknotes and money. And obviously, the problem with that is that many times the money that you got, you couldn't use at a bank in Detroit, Michigan, or Nashville, Tennessee. You can only use it in Columbus, Ohio. So I think one of the things that Bitcoin does is as the economy goes global, I think the financial system is kind of going global too.
Right.
In a way where one country cannot manipulate a currency to benefit themselves.
Right. And the reality is that one Bitcoin is one Bitcoin no matter where you are, right? And so really the real standardization here is that Bitcoin itself is not changing. And so if you're using one Bitcoin here, one Bitcoin there, if you want to convert it into something local, well, that's going to be relative to the local economy and how much it's valued there. But it exists as an economic system outside of all of those local economies and their own corruptions and their own inefficiencies and their own inequalities and inequities, right? And when you have a system that's accessible and that's owned by everybody, regardless of their local economy, that's a very powerful thing. That's a very powerful tool, especially for the working class, where they're working every day to create currency for themselves and create some sort of equity for themselves in the economy. And the problem is that most working classes in most countries, regardless of the country's overall wealth, are not able to do that for themselves. They're essentially only creating units of wealth for the people who own their companies because they're not able to invest that back into themselves. They're not able to save that. They're not able to create retirement funds out of low wages. They're not able to take vacations for themselves for most of the time. When you can't afford the things that are investments in yourself and your own mental health and your own happiness within your society, you're not really earning money. You're simply working for your survival, which is not a pleasant way of looking at it, but that's the reality of the system. Whereas Bitcoin exists fully outside of that paradigm and exists fully outside of that that form of reliance and dependency on a system that wasn't designed with you in mind, or wasn't designed to your benefit.
Right, right. And I kind of see us being in a similar position in the United States that we were in the early 1900s, when the United States didn't have money to pay its debts. So they went to J.P. Morgan and said, "Hey, J.P., can you loan us a
Yeah.
few $100 billion or whatever the amount was?" And he said, "Sure, I'll loan it to you." He said, "But you're going to have to get your house in order. You need to set up a banking system." And so that's how the banking system came to be. J.P. Morgan loaned the money, and one of the stipulations was that the United States set up a federally regulated banking system. That's how the U.S. banking system came to be. Well, we're in a similar position now because they used to call them robber barons, but these guys had so much money. It's like ridiculous the amount of money they had. I remember reading an article once where William Randolph Hearst owned 1 million acres in Mexico. Now, I don't know how much 1 million acres is, but it's got to be a big chunk of land. and he had at one time a net worth of $275 million. Now, this is back in 1860, 1870. So I wouldn't even want to venture to guess what that would be in today's dollars, but it was a lot of money. J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and those guys, they had more money than the whole country, the United States of America.
Yeah.
They had more money in the country, and this is kind of where unregulated, unbridled capitalism kind of winds up, and we're kind of getting back into a space like that. When a guy, and a lot of it's done now through the manipulation of the stock market.
Right.
Because when they say, well, Elon Musk is worth 200 billion, well, he doesn't really actually have $200 billion, but the stock that he has in his company, someone has placed a valuation on it of $200 billion. Now, that doesn't mean he could go and turn it in for 200 billion $1 bills, but that's the value of it. But I think what's happening now is you're seeing we're entering a new era where, you used to have, 15, 20, 30 years ago, you had a few billionaires. Now we have 1,000 in this country. And we also have what's commonly being called now the centibillionaire. There's people in the world with $100 billion. And that's a whole different level of wealth. People always like to talk about the Saudis and the Rothschilds. It's widely believed that those two families have net worth of over $1 trillion. Some people says Putin has a net worth of close to $1 trillion. I don't know, but what my point is that you're seeing the accumulation of wealth within a very small percentage of people. And this is in the same situation that we were in the 1910s and 1920s. And you see what happened then. So capitalism has to have a reset from time to time.
Right.
And I think, then they came out with antitrust legislation. They said, you can't own everything. You can't take a Rockefeller. You can't own the oil wells and the distribution and the gas station and the refineries. Because he owned it. He pretty much owned it all, 98% in the world. And it's in different countries too, not just here. He owned it in different countries. So I think we're kind of getting in a situation like that again. And this time it may not be antitrust legislation, which is an equalizer, but it may be decentralized finance. What do you think about that, Alex?
Well, I think that's exactly why it's working so well, and I think that's the potential for it. The reality is that the former system is not designed to be quickly adaptable to a more equitable system. It's just not. Everything that you could do to try to fix and package and rebandage what we've got to sort of maybe pay a homage back to 1940s and 50s, where you suddenly had a huge change in how you were taxing the rich. You I don't know if it's kind of too late. It's sort of like unburning a turkey, right? When you you put a turkey in the oven and you like take it out, it's burnt, but you can't like put it back in the oven to like unburn it. You're
turn the temperature down.
like the turkey's done, right? Like you've sort of let this it stick a fork in it, right? And so at this point, how do we maybe just we just redesign it in a transitory way? Like you have some transition that could occur. It's not just like overnight you implement an entirely new economic system, but I think that's what we're working on, is the ability to say, okay, let's start small. How do we offer, in lieu of inflation within a traditional market that we haven't fully replaced yet, how do we offer people higher return when they do have some savings, right? How do we offer people incentive for participation in the digital economy? How do we allow people to do business? How do we allow artists and musicians and real estate brokers and people to do business peer-to-peer with each other in more affordable and accessible and immediately settlable ways? How do we maintain equal playing field in terms of the economic system, especially online? All of these, how do you own your data again? How do you take ownership over that? Because it's really the digital economy is standardized by your data. So when you start asking all these important questions, the most obvious answer to every single one of them is decentralized finance. It's a financial system that's owned by us instead, where the financial instruments are fully transparent, where they're built as something that we all share participation in, and we all reap the benefits of that instead of some centralized entity that we have to magically trust to just do the right thing. We no longer need that. And that's where it takes over, right? I think in reality, a lot of the terms themselves will disappear as they become normalized, right? When people talk about a website they like or an app they like, they're not talking about the tech stack that built it, right? They're not talking about the programming languages. They're not talking about the microservices. They're not talking about distributed systems. They're not talking about encryption methods, right? When people talk about something that's useful to them, they talk about it in terms of what it does, right? And I think that's where you'll see real adoption, is when we stop sort of talking about, the technology itself, which I get excited about as a technologist. I get excited about what the technology does because I'm building those things. But for my parents or for, the older generation who's maybe not even as inclined to care about change, when people see these things, most people aren't inclined to care about the tech stack or how it works under the hood. They're more inclined to understand, why does it matter to them, right? And so how do we speak to the people in the gig economy who work for almost no money while, inequitable businesses in the middle take all the money for them doing all the work? Like, how do you give people like that the opportunity to think differently about work and think differently about value and think differently about how they participate in the economy? When people can look at something and immediately understand, one, how do they access it? How is it useful to them? If they have to go through 7 steps to get a wallet working in their Chrome browser, they don't understand any of the terms, and it's obviously designed by programmers. And like, those things are huge barriers to entry. Just one of them would be. But when you have a list of 7 barriers of entry that aren't accessible for the average person, even if the technology itself offers a potential to be accessible to the average person, we haven't designed it in a way that average people can understand it. That's a flaw. That's a problem.
There's a lot of people that still don't believe in computers and using computers.
Right. Because a lot of things about computers aren't accessible, right? You think about how easy a faucet is to use, right? When you walk up to a faucet, it's designed intuitively. You kind of know there's a standard there. You can kind of like turn the faucet on, water comes out of it. It like looks like what it does. You don't have to like label it with like 800 pieces of text to tell you what it does. When you walk up to a door, you kind of know, most doors, you like know how the door works, right? Like you don't need labels on the door to like understand how the door works most of the time, right? And so how do we build technology that people inherently understand the usefulness of, especially in a digital economy when a lot of people, not most people, but some people, plenty of people haven't even, my grandmother in Pennsylvania still has dial-up internet. I mean, these are real people in our own country, let alone third world countries that don't have all the infrastructure yet. They just don't have access yet. And how can we give that access to them? Well, we need to make the technology immediately communicative in terms of what it offers them, and not why it's cool to us as engineers, right?
Right.
And I think that's where you'll see the real usefulness of it. It has all this potential. We're using it. We're excited about it. There are plenty of people benefiting from it who have maybe had the right mentor or the right people around them to like get them onto it. But we have a lot of ways to go in terms of designing it so that people really get it.
Make it user friendly,
Right.
and I think a lot of times, one of the things that I think tech has done, especially when it comes to data, and the acquisition of personal data for the monetization of data, surveillance capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I think one of the things they've done is they made it kind of mysterious. Like I had a kid ask me the other day, he said, "What is this cyberspace? Is it between Mars or is it like beyond Jupiter?" He's cyberspace. Well, cyberspace is a group of computers, probably in Washington State and some other areas, that when you put something in the cloud is, it sounds like, oh, this mysterious cloud. The cloud is a group of computers where you store things. The internet is a group of computers with smart contracts, or with programs that design it to run a certain way. But I think a lot of times people don't understand things because they make them sound mysterious. If they said, well, instead of saying a cloud, say, this is a bank of computers that Amazon uses to store all the information on.
It's Amazon's herd of machines.
Yeah, but you hear the cloud. Where's my money? It's in the cloud. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's
Yeah,
in
and trying to be
cyberspace.
clever
Yeah,
and
you're
trying to be
thinking we're in the
clever.
cyberspace or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
that's true.
think that would go a long way towards people feeling comfortable with new technology, just how it's described.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the cloud, it really sounds cool, but there's probably some people who think it really goes up into a cloud. I don't know.
But yeah, no idea. And unbeknownst to them, most of the things they do every day relies on that, right? Relies on that distributed technology. But but I think it's about that seamless integration into people's lives,
Mhm.
where the products themselves speak for what they do. When you use your smart TV, you know what it offers you. You know why it's cool. You
Mhm.
know how you can connect everything that you want to use on it,
Mhm.
but you're not using your smart TV because it's connected to the cloud. You don't care about the cloud. You don't understand. Most people don't care about that. It's not meaningful to them. What's meaningful to them is like, oh, I can access Netflix.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Like what does it do? And I think that's where we have to get crypto, right? We have to get crypto into the position where people don't have to understand the word NFT. Instead, they can see, oh, an artist that I like is selling their piece. I can get that. And now that piece gives me access to exclusive events with them, or
Mhm.
it allows me access to their upcoming show or their album coming out, right? Like that's where you see the value. It's like, oh, instead of seeing the word NFT, it's like, oh, I bought a ticket to a concert, but now that gives me access to like exclusive merch. I get to go backstage, like whatever the case is. Like, what do these things do for people?
Right.
And once we can communicate that, I think we'll get over all these misconceptions, and it'll just
Yeah,
integrate more seamlessly into
that
people's
will.
lives and help them.
Yeah, and then comes the metaverse. I remember seeing a movie. I'm not sure if it was a Matrix. It was some movie where a guy actually went into a computer. He became, he actually went in part of the computer program. He went into a computer as an electron or something. And the metaverse is sort of like this virtual reality, and it exists in a virtual world, although it has applications to the real world. When you see people with these goggles on, what they're seeing, in a visual and an auditory, what they're hearing is a world. It's an experience, a world of experience. It's an experience to them,
Yeah.
and some people say, well, it's not really real. Yeah, it's real because it exists, and they're, it exists to them. People. I guess now, for gamers, you can take your um, your bad guys, and you can take them from game to game. or you
Yeah,
can design
you
your
can
own.
carry all sorts of things from game. You can carry your weapons or your
Yeah,
whatever,
it's
your
just,
outfit, right? It's
yeah,
breaking down the barriers. And the
right.
reality is, like, a lot of people complain about these technologies, like, oh, they're not real. We're like, every game you've ever played as a person isn't real, right? Like this wasn't Squid Games. Like nobody was playing, like, arcade games in the 80s thinking they're going to get shot at the end. Like I mean, like, and even then the game itself would have been real, the outcome would have been real, right? Like
Right, right, right.
the reality is that so much of our lives are sort of these, like,
Hmm.
ethereal things that we find the most valuable. It's the moments, the memories, the games, the, like, going to a museum, the, like, hey, like, these things that are experiential that
Right,
aren't that different in a digital sense.
right. They're not. And I think one of the things that we want to stress, and maybe the takeaway from today's program, is that all these financial systems kind of run their course. Feudalism, slavery, mercantilism, monarchism, capitalism. They exist. They're born. They exist for 3 or 4 or 500 years, and then they go away. But they don't go away overnight. They're replaced by something. And decentralized finance is kind of replacing capitalism, and you know it solves a lot of problems that you have with capitalism. Socialism was great for Russia and China, but that was replaced by capitalism.
Wasn't good enough for them. Yeah.
Yeah, for them, yeah, they
Right.
say, well, socialism. I'm all for the social stuff, but this capitalism is pretty cool, man.
Right.
You can make a ton of money and you get to keep it all, and you don't have to give anything away. Um, and there's some problems with it, and there's some socialist countries who have a version of socialism that works, and I think the same thing with capitalism. It's time for like a major, not a tweak but an overhaul.
Yeah.
When your car is 4 years old, you might tweak it a little bit and change the plugs or something. When it's 20 years old, maybe it's time to rebuild the engine. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Or
Right.
maybe it's time to get replace your internal combustion engine with electrical, electric car engines or electric car motors or something. So I think capitalism has had some problems, a lot of issues, not the least of being a disparity of income. Um, that's a serious issue worldwide. It's getting worse, and it's just unsustainable. So I think decentralized finance. Alex talked about the reversal of ownership. Where instead of your bank saying you can, I think my bank sent me something the other day. Give us 50 grand, we'll give you a 1.8% interest. I said, oh God, I can't wait for that. Well, with decentralized finance, you can get a much higher rate of interest. For investing your own money, on the blockchain or with what we call staking tokens. So you can earn much more money, but you get to make the decision. The bank will pay me 1.8%, and they'll take the money and invest in the blockchain or stake it, and they'll make 20 or 30%. And that's basically how they make money. But capitalism is, I want to say it's running its course, but it's kind of like running its course.
Right.
And it just this happens with all economic systems. So I guess one thing we want you to take away is read up on decentralized finance, read up on blockchain, read up on cryptocurrency, read up on the metaverse. This stuff is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's growing, and you don't want to be like you know this older gentleman I know. He's much older than me, so he's really old. He doesn't believe in computers. He said I don't need. He said I never learned how to work computers, and he has two fish markets that he's successful. He makes money, he lives in a big house, but he doesn't believe in computers. He said it's just a waste of time. He said he got these books where he writes everything down, and it works for him. Now I'm not so sure how well you could scale that business, without computers, but he probably missed out on some money and probably missed out on a lot of opportunity because he doesn't believe in computers. And because he doesn't believe in computers does not mean that they're not in existence. So the same thing with blockchain, Bitcoin, decentralized finance. don't just brush it off because it's here to stay. And if you take one thing away, take that away
Yeah.
and read up on it and see, how it affects you, because it does affect you. It affects everybody, and it's going to affect us more and more. So with that, I think I'm about out. Anything else, Alex, you want to cover?
No. Yeah, we're good. It was good.
Okay.
Good to be back.
Well, yeah. Again, this is the DeFi Collective. You can reach us on the DeFi Collective at gmail.com. We're on YouTube. Please subscribe. You can reach us at the DeFi Collective or Let's Talk Radio, RADYO, radio with a Y. Let's Talk Radio on YouTube, or the DeFi Collective on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, and if there's something you'd like us to cover dealing with decentralized finance, let us know. The DeFi Collective at gmail.com. Alex Jewell, Robert Vaughn, over and out. See you later.